Because they're all coming to
So right now I'm recording, and I'm going to bring this room to kind of a nice quiet, because you are being recorded, so you know that. It's not a surprise if you ever look at this again sometime and you hear yourself. So I'm going to bring it to get us started. Looks like you have some friends who just come too. I'm going to start this off and try and keep it within the time that I usually make it formal. And I'll start by introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Eileen Maher, who agreed on short notice, thank you very much, to present today for this first Friday based on the work she did for her dissertation. So it's kind of unusual. We don't always have our speakers be our own, but this month Eileen is our own, so I'm really proud of that. For any of you folks who are listening to this from your PC, from your desk, at home or wherever, if I hear any kind of dogs barking or anything like that, I will mute you, and I will hit the mute button from my end, and then you can mute yourself too at home. But if I'm hearing extra noise in the room, so you guys aren't listening to the dog barking and the baby crying. I mean, that's all very nice, and we want this to be informal. But for the first part of this, I've asked Eileen if she can keep this as somewhat formal. That's not to say you can't ask questions along the way. But then when we shut that down and people are listening, then we'll open it up to discussion after. Now, the reason I'm really excited that Eileen will talk today, and I could do the formal introduction, but you've been looking at it of where Eileen works and what she does in her today life, which she'll tell you about, I'm sure, given the results of her study. But the reason I'm really excited about it is when we started this work a long time ago, when she first was in the PhD program and got the opportunity to work with a very large database for a couple of years in a row, we watched things happen and change in the workplace. So I told some of you folks who have firsthand observation, and she does in her life, that the results that she found are pretty interesting. So what I think it'll do is really push a button for discussion. And I asked her to not make this as long as an hour and a half. We have an hour and a half, but longer than the dissertation when I cut her off in 25 minutes. So she can spend a little more time with that. And so I think we're going to have good stuff to talk about. But I'll ask you, when you really see something you're dying to say, oh yeah, I know that, we'll hold that to the end till we get a discussion time. So with that being said, the title that she's using is the big title, which is her dissertation titles are 3 or 4 decks. And I'm going to actually move this little guy over here. I can even shut that down, and I think people can still see us. So don't be surprised if they're still seeing you even though you're not seeing you. All right. And I'm going to bring up her first slide and allow me to introduce to you Dr. Eileen Mahler. Friday. All right. And you're on. Let me make this small and out of your way. All right. You're on, my friend.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. So I'm going to talk a little bit today, as Dr. Peek introduced, about the work based on my dissertation. My interest in this is I'm the Director for Nursing Education over at South Nassau Community Hospital. I'm also the Magnet Program Director there. And we work with many new grads, hire many new grads in, and are very interested in their experiences as they come to us. And we've seen changes over time, as you may have as well, as you go into the acute care environments, those of you who may work there, as well as feedback that you get from the students. So I was very interested in the factors that were influencing the perceived stress of our new graduate nurses. And because I'm in acute care, that was my area of interest. And especially within that first year of transition as they're moving from the student role into the professional nurse role, and what are the challenges that they're facing. So the background of the study was that transition into practice is something that we've all, each and every one of us, have gone through as a new nurse. And depending on when we did it, we probably had very different experiences of that transition. So it's a shared experience we all have. It's inherently accompanied by a gap in skills as we come into that environment and that we move along the continuum of novice to expert that then are identified. The evolution really is a transformative experience for our nurses, and there's many. What are some of the factors that really influence that? So there are antecedents. What are those things that come before the nurse even goes in as a student or as an individual that she or he brings in with them? So it could be their academic experience. What other experiences, not only academic, but life experience or going on missions or outreach within their own communities that they have? What is the support they have, both by their colleagues, their families, the environments that they're going into, the educational environment that they're in? And when they eventually get to the practice environment, what is the support that they have within that environment as well? So we believe a seamless transition into practice for the new nurse really is a key factor in determining their success in their chosen profession, the outcomes of the patients that they will serve eventually, and the advancement of our profession as a whole to keep that moving. So the problem that I saw was, as I looked at the literature, and there is a lot of literature out there on transition into practice, and there has been for many decades, yet it still remains a concern for our profession. So are there things that we can do in the current environment that will impact this? So U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics projects that employment of nurses will grow 16% within the time period from 2014 to 2024, and that's the fastest than any other occupation combined. We know that demands for healthcare services are projected to increase. We know with the aging of the baby boomers, the chronic conditions, and many of us may be seeing that in the acute care environment. Impending shift to a shortage of experienced bedside nurses. So more so than a shortage of nurses, it's going to be an experience shortage that we see. So those same baby boomers that are entering for healthcare services, also as a majority of nurses will be retiring, and then we have nurses with less experience in the arena. We see an increasing complexity and rapid pace of change within current practice environments. And how do we bridge the gaps between formal academic education and the variations in academic education and changes that are occurring in practice settings for new nurses? We know that there are many increased financial pressures on healthcare organizations, reimbursement penalties that lead to job stress because the performance for the nurses, the outcomes on the unit, there's a lot of pressure, whether it's for the patient experience and patient satisfaction, or it's for other clinical measures that organizations are looking at and trying to do well. And there really is a lot of increased pressure for performance in those areas. And then can that increase the likelihood of turnover for new grads? So the purpose of my original study was to identify sources of work environment stress, stressors, and their severity as they were perceived by new graduate registered nurses during that first year of clinical practice in acute care. And I felt it was important because how do we provide nurses with the least stressful environment? We have to explore and learn from them what is stressful, because what may be stressful for us is not stressful for the new graduate nurses. And are there emerging stressors? Are there new stressors that are occurring because of changes in acute care? And it's really important for all stakeholders, whether that's nurse leaders, nurse managers, educators, preceptors, and new graduates themselves need to identify what are these stressors that they experience during transition and what are strategies that will help mitigate them and help them cope better with the stress. We can't eliminate it completely. There is going to be stress, but how can we work with those coping patterns and decreasing what is within our control to decrease? So insights into these factors, I believe, can assist educators and nurse leaders to advocate for transformation of both academic curricula and clinical environment situations that facilitate a more seamless transition for our newest nurses. Okay. There's two theoretical frameworks that I used was Melissa's transition theory, which comes into play with a passage from one state to another. Often it is used more for patient or clinical components, but it can be used for the new graduate nurse and their transition into practice. So that's a situational transition. The properties that are engaged are awareness of the person that they're in this situation or transition, that they're engaged in the process. You will see change and difference over time for the individual. There is a complete time span that you're looking at. And then there are critical points and events during that transition period that are important to that individual, their experience of that. Transition conditions are circumstances that influence how the individual moves through it. So there's things that facilitate that and make it a more positive transition, and there are things that will inhibit that or could be more negative. Patterns of response, it's a process. We want the new grads to feel connected. Are they interacting with others? Are we developing competence in coping? And then the outcome is role mastery and their identity as a professional registered nurse. The therapeutic component of the model relates to activities and actions that nurses develop during transition. The second framework that I looked at was Lazarus and Folkman's transactional model of stress and coping. So that considers stress as a relationship between the individual and their environment. So it's really a two-way process involving production of stressors in the environment and how does the individual respond to that. Again, we all experience stress differently, so what's stressful for one new grad may not be stressful, or actually another new grad may thrive. So we look at nurses who gravitate toward different environments, perhaps who gravitate toward ED environment versus an ultimate or maybe a med-surg environment. Cognitive appraisal is where the individual determines why and to what degree the event is stressful for them, and then coping processes. How do they manage the strain and the emotions that surround stressful events? Okay, so the gap as I look through the literature, again, there was a wealth of literature on transition into practice. Most of the studies I saw were qualitative in nature, and they were restricted to certain regions or hospitals because of that. So my study was qualitative, the use of the National Student Nurses Association database, which was such a rich database on a national level that really, I felt that that would really be a benefit to the research in this area. The predominant stress scales that are used in the literature have really been around for quite a while. So if we look at Holmes and Rahi's stress scale, that was from 1967. Graytoft and Anderson's and Cohen and Carmack's scales have been around since the 80s. So really healthcare and the environment has changed since that time. So do we need to look at those scales, and is there something different that perhaps we want to be examining? So in a rapidly reforming healthcare system, are there new stressors that are evolving that perhaps were not captured by those scales? Okay. So looking at the literature and the qualitative studies had a great richness of information in them. Between that and my own experiences, I did come up with a model looking at the stressors in the work environment, because that's something that's more within our control. Other stressors that new grads may be facing, such as student loan debt, personal components, is more beyond our control to do that. So I came up with three subcategories. One is the work environment characteristics, and that could be their pace of clinical workflow, the nurse's workload and responsibilities, accessibility of equipment, electronic documentation systems, work schedule and shifts, and their unit staffing ratios. When I looked at unpredictable work environment characteristics, we looked at patient acuity, because that can vary from one setting to the other. What are those end-of-life experiences? If a new grad has not experienced a death or a code before, what is that experience like for them? Emergency clinical situations, again, looking at a patient experiencing a stroke or a hemorrhage, or again, deterioration. And potential for workplace injury, and almost now I would say workplace violence as well, depending on the setting that the nurses are in. Interpersonal work environment characteristics relate to peer interactions, and that can be communications with supervisors, with physicians, patients, delegating to unlicensed staff for new graduates, and experiences of verbal abuse. So I had several research questions, and it was hard to delineate because the database is so rich, so there were so many interesting questions, but my wonderful committee members helped me to kind of bring that down a little bit and focus in. So I wanted to know what demographic attributes influence new graduate RN perception of stress during the first year of clinical practice in the acute care setting. And are there differences in the attributes? I looked at age, gender, education, and the program type the new grad was in, and the RN's perception of the clinical work environment characteristics, those interpersonal characteristics, or the unpredictable work environment characteristics. The second one is because I had a great opportunity to work with the NSNA database. I started in my first research residency and was able to continue that work between the 3 research residencies. I was able to look at that data over time. So I was very interested, is there a change? The Affordable Care Act, many of the provisions were coming into effect in 2014. And how are those changes really going to influence the pace, the work environment, and then in turn impact the new nurses? So I was able to look at data from the period of 2013 to 2015 for my study. The antecedent factors that predict new graduate perception of stressors, I looked at 4 of them. One, I wanted to know about the belief that the new nurse, that her education program, his or her education program, adequately prepared them for what to expect in their first position. The level of participation in clinical simulation. If they had prior clinical experiences, and that could have been as a nurse aide or in a clinical environment. And also participation in an RN residency program. Okay, the design was quantitative, descriptive study, and again, it was respondents in the NSA survey, annual survey. It was a cross-sectional design for the 2013 through 2015 period, and I used descriptive and inferential statistics to analyze the data. So the survey items, and there were 18 items that I used for the survey, to measure the nurse's perception of stressors within the environment within those 3 domains that we had spoken about. And they were first introduced, again, I had the opportunity that my questions, the 18 items, Diane Mancino included in the study after we had met, because we were interested in speaking to each other, one about the new grads, and she was very interested in what was happening in the acute care setting. So she was very interested and added it to the NSNA survey. We used a 4-point Likert scale, and that was to remain consistent with the other questions that she used in the NSNA survey. And the clinical work setting stressors were characterized into those same 3 domains we spoke about. I did look for content validity for the tool because it was new. It was based on literature and my experiences with new grads. So I had 5 nursing experts who facilitated new grad programs in acute care settings to say. And looking at the CVI and the SCVI, so to determine the efficacy of the scale, which it did. The stress, the dependent variable, the 4-point scale was 0 if it was not applicable, because there was sometimes maybe a particular question, night shifts was not applicable to that particular nurse, so it would be a 0. 1 is if the event or category was not stressful for them, 2, somewhat stressful, and 3, very stressful. So the independent variables for the demographics were gender, age, education, degree, and program type. And the 4 variables of interest for academic preparation, their prior clinical experience, the preparation through simulation, and participation in the residency program. I did go through Molloy's IRB. It was a secondary data analysis, so that data had been collected already. And then inclusion was those nurses that had secured an RN entry-level position. So looking at the data collection, the initial responses, you can see the richness of the data set and the numbers by year from 2013 to 2015. But that was the initial. So to get the population that I was looking for first year in acute care, there was a lot of cleaning of the data that needed to be done, which was an interesting process going through that, and that is one of the more time-consuming processes of it. But prior to data analysis, examination and cleaning the data was conducted using SPSS. The level of significance was at p less than 0.05, And then data were assessed to make sure that they met the required assumptions. Okay. And we used multiple tests, descriptive statistics, reliability analysis on the 18-item scale and those 3 subscales. ANOVA, correlational analysis, independent sample t-test, and a linear regression. So the sample size for the 2013 to 2015 subjects was 8,061. And then looking at the 2015 subset for those antecedent variables was 2419. So looking at the sample characteristics, both the 3-year sample and the 2015 subset that I used, the majority of subjects were female, and that really represents what we find in the workforce very much, about 10% male and 90% female. The age characteristics, the majority were less than 28 years old. Their ethnicity was primarily Caucasian, but there is an increase you can see between when we looked over the 2013, 14, and 15, there was an increase in minority groups. Education, the majority were bachelor's prepared, and then for the program type, the majority of subjects were in public programs. Okay, the reliability analysis were conducted both on the 3-year, the 2013 through 2015 surveys, and the alpha was 0.84 on that, and for the 2015 survey, it was 0.86, reflecting good internal consistency. So a review of some of the key findings were that there are differences in the RN attributes for age, gender, education, and program type, and the RN perception of clinical work environment characteristics. So when we looked at the work environment subscale and the gender, it was significant as far as the male, I'm sorry, I can't read it from here. The male stress being less than the female stress related to gender and work environment components. Okay, when we looked at the age, those nurses under 22 years reported that they had decreased stress than the older nurses. So when you see those nurses over 39 or any age, you can see that the stress is increasing at the age level. And we were looking at, does that relate to the pace of the clinical work environment or the adaptability of the individual. When we looked at subscale and education and subscale and program type, there was no significant difference in those domains. When we looked at the attributes with the interpersonal work environment, you're going to see something a little different than we saw in the one before. So again, the male stress level is lower. It was significant that it was lower than the female. When we look at the interpersonal subscale and age, though, it flips, that those under 22 had increased stress levels, and as the ages increase, that the stress levels are decreased. Program type was not statistically significant. When we did look at education, though, for interpersonal, the interpersonal domain, it was significant that those nurses that were bachelor prepared reflected increased stress levels. Differences between new graduate attributes and the unpredictable work environment. Again, the male stress ratings were lower. That was significant. For the unpredictable subscales and age, we again see for the unpredictable environment that as the age increases, that the stress was decreasing. Subscale and program type, that was found to be statistically not significant, but when we go back to education, again, there was a significant effect for the bachelor's prepared nurses. Looking in the differences over time, and for this one we looked, I did a one-way ANOVA on the mean sum of stress scores. So looking from 2013 to 14, you can see that there was an increase over time. And again, looking at the majority of changes that were going on in health reform, many of them hit in 2014. So we can see a shift between 2014 and 2015. I'd be curious to see how they march out over time, continue to march out over time.
The data's all there.
Okay.
Anytime you want to do it.
Okay, all right, I'm going to take you up on that. Okay. The differences in perception of clinical expressors by new grads who believe that their nursing education program adequately prepared them for what to expect, was significant. So for those that felt that they were prepared adequately, their stress scores were decreased. And we looked at I looked at an ANOVA and linear regression model summary for the if nurses felt their education adequately prepared them. Simulation was an interesting finding when we looked at the differences in the perception of clinical stressors between new grads based on their level. And making it dichotomous, we looked at less than 10% simulation versus greater than 10% simulation. I know we look at in the Journal of Nursing Regulation as you look up to like 50%, like simulation kind of equalizes with the clinical environment for nurses. So it would be slightly different there. But those that had more than 10% had higher stress levels than those that had less. And there are many suppositions for why that might be, which might be an area we could discuss. And again, the linear regression model summary. Okay, there were no differences in perceptions of stressors with new graduates with higher healthcare experience, so it wasn't significant, but those with experience, their scores were slightly lower than those that did not have it. It was about 84% actually reported that they do have prior healthcare experience. And there were no differences in the perception of stressors by new graduates who participated in nurse residency programs, which is also another finding. We, anticipated a different answer to that. But again, there may be varied reasons for that. Okay. And then the regression model summary, looking at the nurses, if education adequately prepared them. And the regression model really only accounted for 6% of the variance. It was really low. So conclusions were there were differences in the respondent perception of clinical work environment stressors based on gender and age. Interpersonal, there were differences based on gender, age, and education, as well as with the unpredictable stressors for gender, age, and education. There was an increase in the reported stress over time in the 2013, 14, and 15 surveys. There were no differences based on nursing program type, new graduate prior healthcare experience, or the blind residencies. And then again, in the once we entered academic preparation, simulation, and age into the regression model, it only explains 6% of the variance. And there are many, you can think that there are many factors that are influencing it that are beyond that. Even when I think of all the categories in the NSNA database, what is asked, there were so many more that we could have put in or looked at with that. So the strengths is I really feel from the secondary data analysis that the National Student Nurses database is really what will help us with new grads and really information on that. So the researcher does need to be familiar with the data set when you're looking to address varied research questions. And it was a unique opportunity for me being able to contribute my own survey questions to that database. And then the secondary analysis offers high quality data. You can look at the data over time, looking for those trends and patterns, and to obtain a national database of that magnitude to go beyond your own region. What is happening on a national level for new graduates is important, and it was cost effective as well. The content and quality of the set are really aligned with the theoretical foundations that I had for my study and to look for new knowledge related to transition of new graduate nurses. There were some limitations. The survey is a self-report measure. The sample size wasn't randomly selected. The stressors were confined to those within clinical environment versus personal stressors that nurses may have in other personal, financial, spiritual, or other domains that may impact them during their transition. And then the limitation is that the variables are restricted to those items and questions that were originally asked in the NSNA survey. And I really did do a thorough assessment of the survey to look for the variables that look to include and have value for my model. The delimitations of the study is there was an exclusion of new graduates transitioning into non-acute care, and nurses are going into many varied settings, so that would be of interest to know. The range of the Likert scale was very narrow to be consistent with the NSNA existing survey, and it is reflective of new graduates in the United States, so we can't extract that to international component. So for nursing research, I think that successful transitions into practice take on more importance, especially in our current era of healthcare reform and the evolving demands in the workplace and decreasing resources in the workplace. It's important to identify meaningful ways that we can support our new graduates during transition and eliminate unwarranted stress, what stress is within our control, to try to minimize. If we analyze the data, it can inform leaders in academic and clinical settings to develop interventions to support transition of new grads and transform nursing education to prepare them for new skills that they'll need that are emerging in professional practice. And can we create clinical environments, nurse leaders partnering in academia and clinical settings that cultivate excellence in practice and enable our new nurses to thrive in the environments that they'll be working in. For education, educators in both settings are positioned to guide new nurses to understand what are those innate stressors that they're going to be experiencing when they're out in the environment, and assist them to incorporate self-care modalities and stress reduction strategies that they can tap into not just when they're doing that program, but to do that throughout their entire career. And what are those critical points and events during transition that will identify certain patterns of response for new grads? And how do we develop tactics to support them when the new grads face those critical events and new situations in varied practice environments? So we can't completely eliminate stress, but how can we use science and research to have an introspective lens for educators to examine those stressors and really find innovative solutions to transform our practice environments and the nurses' response to have a better experience for our new grads. So my recommendations were to identify what are those emerging stressors as well as existing ones. The new grad support, we know it's increasing. Again, looking to see is it still increasing, and how do nurse leaders monitor these trends and partner to implement strategies to diminish stress in the work environments. And then also include content in curricula for stress reduction and what is the reality of the workplace stressors that new grads will be facing. And then also building stress appraisal and coping techniques for them and benefit them, have them use those as lifelong habits. So I did want to do as what I had last year. So I did a preliminary exploratory factor analysis, but I didn't go back for my confirmatory factor analysis yet. Presentation and dissemination of findings at a research forum. So I am on board for a podium presentation at a research forum for this as well. And consider publication after our magnet document is done.
First things first.
Okay.
First things first.
And then looking at the differences and experiences of new grads in various specialties. Exploring effectiveness of stress reductions modalities, and we're doing quite a lot of that in our organization. So actually I am doing a study of the new grads within our organization using my same tool for nurses within our RN residencies for ED, critical care, and actually also med-surg. So I included all the areas. So I'm very interested in seeing is there a difference between those new grads perhaps in the ED setting versus those in the maternal child setting that we have to look at that. And we do have a group of nurses that we took to Magnet last year because it was ANA's looking at the healthy year, the year of the healthy nurse. There were so many presentations on self-care that they came back very vitalized, that we now have an RN Stress Busters team that actually are doing their own evidence-based project. They did a survey, like with the staff, and they've already implemented meditation. They're looking at other things on units like code lavender cards for the staff. One group set up all these teas in their area so that the nurses had a place to go centering. So they're taking it on a unit-based level to see what can they do in their environment to mitigate the stress. And my references for that.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Does anyone know what that picture is?
Oxygen.
That's Florence Nightingale's original lamp. Okay, so that's just for our new grads. We want to keep the spark of the fire going here, but that's what the lamp actually looks like.
That is awesome. Awesome. As I said, I knew she pushed some buttons. I'm going to get rid of the little blinky light for you. You actually can sit if you prefer. That's up to you. Let me get rid of this. We'll keep this up. Those of you folks who are on the phone call end or on your PCs, we're going to move to a Q&A format, so you won't see people who are asking questions, but the microphones are good enough you should be able to hear them. And even wherever Eileen wants to sit, at the head of the table or wherever she'd like to sit, we can open this up for discussion.
Great, I'm curious to see your thoughts.
Keith.
Yes. First off, thank you very much for an engaging presentation that resonated very well with me, and I have to say it's probably the first time in my PhD career that I actively took notes. So
That's not a good thing.
but in any case, no, I just wanted to make mention my own personal history of work-related stress is that having graduated in Quebec at a time where unemployment rate was very low for nurses. And seeing that dramatically changed as I graduated, as there was a shift in the way that care was delivered. I'm starting to see the same thing here today. The jobs report just came out this morning, and it's still not quite as rosy as they thought, but still quite kind of rosy, and not quite. I didn't see any distinction between nurses. However, we're in a period of hyper-consolidation with all the hospitals, coming together, and the acquisition of these faculty practices where they're taking over all the doctors' offices. And I'm just wondering how the change in the labor market between the hyper-consolidation and between the push with new technology, medical technology, seeing more patients, vertical, less horizontal, that we're seeing more outpatient, just basically the overall trend in the paradigm in which healthcare is delivered. What kind of stress you think that might have on new nurses?
Well, I think we would need to look at those other environments as they're going into those other settings, whereas this focus on acute care, which traditionally was the main environment that most of the nurses went in or started in. But we know that we're not seeing that now because of new models of care or that. But again, with the services or the regulations, still move out into those other areas. So would not there still be some stressors? But I think that would be great and a great idea to look at stress within those other settings of care to see, is there a difference? I'm sorry.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Eileen?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. It's Tori Siegel. I'm sorry.
Hi,
listening
how are
from
you?
home. I'm on my computer. Did I jump in front of somebody? I apologize.
Hey, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Tori.
Oh, all right. I just thank you for coming and thank you for giving this talk. And I was wondering if I would be able to share your information with our education students. I teach teaching the master's education program, nursing education program. And I think they would very much be interested in this.
Oh, absolutely.
Is that okay? All right, great.
Yes,
and then,
Tori, it's being recorded, so you can even do it seamlessly by sending them to the video, and they can watch it and flip the classroom and come and talk about it.
Oh, that's a neat idea.
yes, I was hoping I could do that, in a hybrid format, so I could do that as one of their activities when we're not face-to-face.
Okay. That would be great.
With regard to stress reduction, I was thinking of mindfulness meditation when you were speaking, and also about deep breathing and the breathing techniques to reduce stress. And that would be a great thing to implement in your work, and your nurses are already doing that, so it's fantastic. My whole school district here by Huntington has integrated mindfulness into the classroom, so the whole school district does it. They do mindfulness training with all the teachers and all of the students, and they do it every single day. So it's pretty cool. And you could even have the nurses just center themselves before they enter a patient's room.
Right.
And things like that. As you said, you want them to learn these stress reduction techniques and incorporate them into their lives. And as nurses and people that teach health promotion, that's an excellent way to teach them and to role model that behavior.
Yeah, those are great points. Actually, when you were talking about centering yourself before you enter the room, we had one group of our nurses that they were teaching the new grads on their unit that when you go to gel your hands, to wash your hands before you approach the patient, that's your moment to take your deep breath, center yourself before you deliver care. So I think that's
what a great thing, because then you're combining hand washing with that. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to mute myself again so I don't interrupt anybody.
You have a note from the dean. Marcia just sent a note. I'll pull that up after. It said great. I saw it before it flipped out. So she's listening in as well.
Oh, great. That's wonderful.
I think as educators, we're always wrestling with the push and pull between the organization and the academic setting. Our students never can transition immediately into a nursing role. It just doesn't happen. They don't have 6 patients when they go into their clinicals. And it's always, it's going to be difficult for them and helping them prepare. And I think back to many years ago, I walked onto a unit and one of my old graduates was working on that unit nights, and she had the stethoscope around her neck, and on the stethoscope was a roll of toilet paper. And I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "It's just easier." But I think, we all know that happens. And I think sometimes I feel like there's unrealistic preparation in education, and sometimes I think there's unrealistic expectations in the organizations. And to try and mesh that is really, really difficult. Now, teaching one of the final courses before graduation, the leadership course, self-care, I'm sitting here thinking we need to put self-care into that. And monitoring your reactions and identifying your stressors and preparing yourself for that. And it's not in it. So it would be a valuable addition.
Right. That would be great.
So, and the other question I did have to ask was, the RN-BSN, were they already working as RNs?
Yeah.
So does that kind of...
I was trying to look into the literature to find why might that have been that, and I couldn't really find something that identified that was higher. But just looking in the literature, are they in different or more high stress practice environments? Might an ED hire? I know in our area it's hard for AD nurses to get positions. So might those AD nurses be in less critical care positions? So I'm not sure what, and I don't know, but just to try to think, why might that be? Or do they have more responsibility, or are they hired into positions, with more responsibility? I don't know. Anybody else think of any other reason why that might be from your perspective?
Well, I was thinking maybe it's an internal thing. Maybe they are the kind of person that wants to improve and have higher, just what you said, higher expectations for themselves.
That could be too.
Hi. That was great, by the way. And of course, my interest is in simulation. And I just wanted I wrote down a couple notes as to why maybe the stressors might be more after graduation and not under the protection of a program, having to do with more evaluative processes. Once you're working, is the evaluative process more about potentially losing your job or remediation versus, we provide the safe environment here in the school, and, whatever mistake, it stays in the room, and we're here to teach you, and you're here to learn from it.
Right.
I think that could be one piece of it. Yeah. I also think 2015, I have to say, for our own program, really starting in the end of 2015, where we really started aligning the simulation program with our curriculum to sort of target where the strengths and weaknesses are and kind of support those pieces. And I think now if you ask students after they've had now several semesters in this year of 2018 and on, after they've had several semesters and feel a little bit better about what simulation is supposed to be for them in terms of a learning experience and a growing experience, that the results might be a little bit different coming out. And I'm sure you didn't tease this out, about your question of simulation, but I was just wondering the type of simulations, because simulation is, as such a broad term, was that, a role play in the classroom, or was that you were exposed to 10 high fidelities that prepared you for your emergency room? And so I just wanted to get your opinion. I just wanted to get your thoughts on when you came up with that statistic, that data. What do you think as the educator?
I think when I did look into it, again, it's a national sample at that time, and looking at the programs, and there's simulation programs in schools throughout the nation, and what is, again, the quality, how are those simulations being delivered, and the consistency of the educators, the technical programs that are being delivered. And just I thought that it might be along like those lines, that there'd be so much variability, and not the level of detail into the amount, the type, similar to it.
Right.
You can appreciate it's a bear to quantify it.
Right. Yeah.
There is the difficulty to be able to quantify it. So this is as close a proxy that was possible because it went back several years before. You're stuck with the way it gets asked. There's a real interest in sorting out. There's online information as well. And that one's another bear to try and quantify. We do the how much of your program is online, less than 25%. It's self-report. It's best you can. So it's really hard to quantify. But it's a proxy that asks those questions that I think are so valuable. How do we do it? What makes it better? And when we drill down, we co-authored a paper on an earlier analysis and looked at the individual items that were fascinating, and the ones that were connected were talking to people, talking to physicians, talking to patients. So those stressors were higher when the students reported simulation. So as an individual element, and we didn't do that. No, this wasn't part of this analysis. But were you on that paper yet? No answer yet?
I'll talk to you later.
No answer yet.
Okay, I'm just not clear. Was the simulation in place of clinical experience or in addition?
It was a limitation of the database and the way the question was asked, so it could really only quantify it by the percentage.
But it's a bear to try and figure out and have someone who already has 72 questions to answer. To then add is it part of your, because if it's course related, is it so? But doing it because your interest being simulation, those are the studies we really need to do. Those are the ones we really need to do.
So more inquiry into simulation, and there is more now, than there was, previously and earlier on.
Right. Well, the transition to practice, I was just on in a patient safety and transition to practice new grad collaborative group I was on last weekend. That was the topic, and it was kind of reinventing the wheel. Well, maybe we should start to look at the literature related to simulation. And somebody was saying, well, there's this study, there's that study. I'm kind of amazed that there haven't been more studies.
And beyond, for me, aligning with my study, beyond the clinical simulation is the interpersonal simulation for our new grads. And I know we've even done that when we had our November mandatories. We did act-out scenarios, very brief vignettes that we tape. Varied nurses come volunteer, act out a real patient scenario that we got from our patient experience team, patient or visitor scenario, put it up, and then what would you do? And then had a dialogue. Okay, how would you respond if this was the patient's concern or that, to kind of get them, what words would you use to try to diffuse that? And it was just so interesting. We feel like we need to do more of that because a lot of it is the interpersonal communication. And sometimes our newer nurses seem to struggle with that more so, whereas they can never shut us up, like with our group, with our patients. But it's a little bit harder. For them. How can we cultivate that?
So I'm working with Eileen this semester because my senior level students are going to, and I have to say, I have never had such a positive experience. It's just amazing. Like, I expect them to be more stressed. Like, I keep thinking, why aren't you stressed? And they're in critical care, they're in ED, they're in mother baby, and 100% said it's because of the work environment, the culture.
Yes.
And that every preceptor has been, patient, doesn't make them feel intimidated. Like, I'm just amazed at how positive their experiences have been, including med-surg units, where now the ratio is 1-7 or 1-8, and they've only taken care of one. And they're doing everything incrementally, and they've had a really very positive experience, I have to say.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
The other thing I was going to ask you about, when you said there's going to be a, lack of experienced bedside nurses, is it all because we're the dying locker room, or is it because after 2 years they're seeking out different things? Like, I met like 100 of my students there, and they're all going on to be nurse anesthetists or nurse practitioners, and it seems like they're choosing to be away from the bedside.
Right. Well, even when we interview the nurses, or very interesting, because there was a question that I was looking at in the NSNA study, and over 60%, I don't remember the exact, but it was over 60% plan to leave their current job within 2 years. Now, remember, these are new grads only in the first year, so regardless of their stress, 6% were not going to stay in that role longer than the 2 years.
Isn't that typical millennial, though? I mean, they all, it's not just nurses.
But they're not millennial. I mean, we have the age distribution too.
Yeah.
And they're all the same and how long they've been out, but you can't associate it with the brand new 21-year-old. So it's not just.
And I know Connor's
Eileen's
study
point-
out of
Eileen's point is
NYU
valid.
reflected that as well.
That's
I think it was
the trend
17% left within the first year, and it was hers was more, I think, in the 30s if it was within the second.
Well, for us
year.
old folks, Marlene Kramer did it in 1970.
Oh, wow.
Right.
They called it a lateral arabesque.
Oh.
It was in the dance jargon of you step into the first job and then you do a lateral arabesque out of it.
Don't you feel like, I feel like we almost encourage them that, just get really solid for 2 years. I hear that a lot. So I don't know if it's new that people are saying that, but I have that also. We have all these new grads and they all have that 2-year plan, seems like.
I've had several clinical groups, and I make a point of asking them at the end what their plans are, and at least 50% of the time, 50% of the students, they respond they're going to go on to become nurse practitioners or nurse anesthetists. They do not plan to stay at the bedside.
We hear that when I'm involved in the interviews for our telemetry residency program, and almost 99% of the nurses, when we ask for your long-range plan, it is to be a nurse practitioner. So, which is great for advancing the education, but then how do we manage the bedside component? I know in dialogue with our human resources, they're looking at, well, how do we stop? I don't think we can stop the turnover, but how do you manage it and create opportunities? Like, so when we create, like in the maternal child division, fellowship programs there, looking at psychiatry fellowship programs there, other opportunities within our own organization. So you're here in med-surg or telemetry, but can we retain you to our organization as a valued nurse, but move you, perhaps in another area or direction?
But so many of the organizations have gotten rid of clinical nurse specialists, and that would be the way to hold on there.
Yes.
It's hard because there's limitations on their role in New York State too.
Right.
Which,
Does the job market not encourage that as well? Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay.
I'll just be real quick. Not encourage it because, and I don't know what it's like these days, but when I had first graduated, there were a lot of positions that I was looking for that said requires 1 to 2 years of med-surg experience prior to that, and perhaps that might seem as a prerequisite.
I don't know if I've seen that as much. Like, we don't require, in some of the fellowship programs we will for ED or critical care, we require them to have the 1 to 2 years of, it could be med-surg, it could be tele for them for fellowship, but we'll also take new grads. Those programs are just longer than the fellowship program. So it's just a different track, but we take new grads in those
Sorry
areas.
about that. Thanks.
Now, I was just thinking from my own experience with the graduate students that I have, and many of them are not out of school very long. So, and I think part of that is there is that encouragement. A lot of these students, I had them as undergraduates, and the names, because it hasn't been that long. They recognize the names, and I see the faces, and so I think part of that is because they are encouraged and they to go back for more education, and they get reimbursement and all those positive things. And then I think when they feel that they have that education, that they want to do something more with it. But what I've also found interesting from the relatively young graduate students of where, and I don't know that you could tease this out, where the issues were with interpersonal. You mentioned patients, but I'm telling you, in those graduate classes, those nurses, most of them, and some of them that have even been out of school for more time, they talk about nurse to nurse. That almost, I figured, I'd hear, doctors. That's not what I'm hearing.
No.
That's not what I'm hearing. And it's not even so much the patients, although like last semester I had a lot of, in the psych NP program, and they were already working in psych. But it wasn't that kind of that interpersonal issues that they were, because maybe that's the expectation in terms of the patient population. But what really was bothersome to them was treatment from other nurses. That was the thing that,
My graduate class is the same thing.
It kept
Same
coming
thing.
up.
It's
Every
bullying.
class.
It's really bullying.
It kept coming up. And so that is something I think, we really need to.
We've been facing that for years too.
Right.
They call that horizontal violence.
Yeah. And, it's mostly verbal. It wasn't, mostly what people were reporting
But
to
it
me.
was also assignments, right?
The way they're treated,
we'll see if
yes.
she can handle this.
Right, the way they're treated,
those
yes.
Those types of behaviors are
Yes.
still occurring.
Like
Right.
a hazing. Hazing.
Right,
Yes.
yeah. And that is, is that interpersonal piece that maybe we really need to look at. And it's hard because, a lot of these people are on nights. And so, how many house supervisors,
each other. They have to step up for each other. That's the only way to do it. It can't just be from management.
Yeah,
it has
I agree.
To be.
Yeah.
If you're working and you see this, say that's not fair.
Right.
That,
And setting up those programs, I know we had an influx toward the end of the summer last year with new grads, and we had so many, and we were concerned that we as educators would lose track of them just because of the volume. So we set up a forum, and we called it Safe Haven. So we set up for both the day and the night nurses that the educators would meet with them, whether it was in a corner of the cafeteria or we have an atrium area that will be here, each night, this many days, to come. And if they had anything they just wanted to discuss, it's a safe haven, talk about it. The educator could give them advice on whatever it may, be. So, to kind of like those tales from the bedside, what's going on, and can you give them some solutions, words that will work when they go back, to that setting. Sometimes with our group, it was the support staff and delegating to support staff that a lot of our new nurses found to be quite difficult.
I did have one, don't yell at me. I did have one comment from one of the nurses who was a student of mine years ago, and a male nurse, and he said, I have to tell you, I love working here because it's almost, a lot of male nurses, and they're definitely easier to work with. So I think that's an interesting comment that he was saying. So I asked both my classes. I asked my fundamentals class, and all the female students said, oh, absolutely. And then I asked the male students, and they said, we're not going to answer that question. Then I asked my senior level, and they all 10 out of 10 agreed. So to your point about interpersonal relationships, I said, what are we going to do about this? They said, you're not allowed to say anything.
Men add a different dimension.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the hopes that in my study that I could take a look at that, look at a little bit more gender balance, getting more males into nursing, because I think we do offer some things that are unique that could help attracting more men into the profession and advancing nursing as a profession. I'm interested, and I don't want to put the spotlight on our newest nurse, who I think is our newest nurse. But since my daughter is a new graduate from Molloy and has been out of practice about 8 or 9 months, I saw that in one of your slides you talked about verbal abuse. And I'm kind of curious as if your study somehow extrapolated the difference between what's abuse and what's encouragement or needed correction. Because sometimes I think people believe mistakenly that they're being verbally abused or it's bullying, which are significant issues, absolutely. But we all had to kind of cut our teeth. And I heard that everyone say that earlier. So did you tease that out a little?
We didn't get into that level of detail, and verbal abuse was interesting because when I did the, which I didn't include in the study, but looking at the exploratory factor analysis, it did not align with that domain. So it almost looked like it was something else other than the interpersonal by itself, which was interesting and merits, like more exploration. Looking at it that way.
I think so. From my perspective, I think it would be interesting to teach young people how to differentiate between the two. It's very important because some of it's corrective, and the nurse manager or the nurse educator maybe just wanting to, broaden your skill level and make you into a better nurse, not necessarily something that you should take personally.
That's great.
Right. And sometimes that varies with the individual because if you are doing correction, I've heard from our educators that they'll need that sometimes that correction is taken kind of in a dramaful way by the new grad. And it's like, it's just really to help you. And we need to bring these things forward to you to help you learn and grow. And it's not in a negative way, but sometimes it's perceived that way. So we work hard to try to look at the words that we're using, but there's certain things you can't do it this way, like it needs to be done this way, or we're looking at what's the outcome for the patient, et cetera, the words we're using with patients and families. So it's to try to help, and most of the nurses do, but sometimes I think it's similar to you say that it's the correction versus the verbal abuse. Yeah.
As I'm listening, first of all, your study is just so important and wonderful. And not even but, just and. And so I'm thinking, I teach in the nurse practitioner program, and so many of them, and I really am going to take a leap here and say so many, when I read their entrance essays, when I hear them talking, they love nursing. They would be better off staying or maintaining and become better nurses. And I wish we could do something that they wouldn't. I mean, I love that they're in our program, but many of them are not suited for it. And you read their essays, they'll tell you how I love being a nurse, how I always dreamed of being a nurse, but now I want to increase my education. But they're not always being accepted by the other nurses. Not for a while. They talk about that, even in their training. I wonder what we can do to make them. I hate the word stay. What's a better word? Just succeed. Succeed as a bedside nurse.
Or bring those roles that they are in the bedside. Is there a different model that
like
could
that
be
clinical ladder
developed with
piece
advanced practice
there's
nurses in the bedside?
Right now, and I can only speak from my own, where I am, but there isn't any benefit really to if you now have a higher level of education.
Exactly.
Unless you the self, there's that self-satisfaction. I'm not saying that, but you're not looked at as an expert.
The clinical ladder looks at that though.
Yeah, but not a lot of places don't have that anymore.
They don't get recognized as subject matter experts.
Right, because
And
there's no.
if they get the extra,
There
the
still
additional.
are a lot of places that have it.
Yeah.
So the only thing they can do is change jobs.
Exactly.
Right.
I don't know what the statistics are.
Oh, somebody from the outside, please chime in.
Hi, sorry, Tori again. I was wondering maybe if we can decrease the stress at the bedside and reduce the nurse to patient ratio and improve working conditions and decreasing stress, nurses will want to stay at the bedside and have a more rewarding career. And if we have the minimum education be at least a bachelor's, then we'll be more esteemed by, the public, and, we could see improvement in that way.
Well, I'll speak to that a little, Tori Trani. I'll speak to that because I went to the BS in 10 panel discussion last week at the New York Academy of Medicine, And the language used to be entry into practice, you had to have bachelor's. The language now is promoting advanced career preparation. So it's advancing your career and respecting the advancement that a bachelor's brings, for those who don't have it, and a master's would bring. And I think that we really do need the conversation of advanced pathways that are multiple. And within a culture that understands what it takes to be that exquisite expert at the bedside, put the respect that goes with that level of practice. And I think nursing, the discipline, needs to look at that. I really think that's something we need. We've narrowed choices in advanced career planning to singular pathways where we don't give opportunity for other things that are respected, rewarded. You make more money, frankly, if you stay at this point in time, you stay in the job with your master's or PhD. You'll make a whole lot more money, trust me, at the bedside than you will in some of the other possible options. But I think that what people perceive as the respect that goes with advanced education, we ought to have that conversation with nursing. And I mean, you bring really good points from this kind of study.
Right, I agree. And what I observe in clinical, because I'm doing clinical rotations with fundamental students, but I'm observing the nurses on the units, and they don't seem to feel empowered. And you know, the different disciplines will come in at different times, and it doesn't seem like the nurse is in charge of the patient and the scheduling of the patient and different things. And, you know, it's common, there's only women on this unit, but so she is just waiting for physical therapy, let's say, to get the patient out of bed. And that, like, totally irks me, because nurses can get the patient out of bed. Nurses can evaluate if the patient can stand and walk and do simple tasks like that. But they just hand it over to the physical therapist. I think as nurse educators, we have to look at those kinds of things. And what are we teaching our students? What are we teaching them in clinical? You know, are we not teaching them to be empowered, to speak up, to do, to act, to say, no, I can do this and it's okay? And it's certainly not a policy to wait for the physical therapist to give clearance on that. But some nurses still do it. And I checked, it's not policy. So it's very interesting. And I think that we have to make sure that we're teaching students to be empowered and to move nursing forward.
I think that with the advanced education, particularly that institutions support it, that, you know, they give tuition reimbursement, and nurses take advantage of that in a positive way. I don't have statistics on this, but I think there are many graduate nurse practitioners who are working as staff nurses. Probably more than the ones that are working as nurse practitioners.
75% in a study we did 2 years ago.
Yeah.
75% keep their job.
So I think, and it's because they realize, first of all, there's a million people with nurse practitioner, you know, certification now, but also too, the salary differential is not that different. The support system is completely different. So the fact that the organizations provide tuition reimbursement explains that there is value to education and that the nurses take advantage of it. So their original intent might be, I'm going to be a nurse practitioner, but they go through the advanced education. Many of them stay at their jobs. And I think that's a positive thing.
It would be, because they bring that greater level of experience, and they can be a measure against those newer nurses as well. So.
And you know, in terms of their caring for patients as well.
The expertise.
The quality of care.
I was surprised that the younger nurses said they had less stress in the work environment. Because in the classroom, they're always so stressed. That I would expect the older ones who have dealt with more in life to be able to handle the stress better than the younger ones. And you didn't find that. That surprised
but sometimes
me.
the work environment relates to the pace. It did have the ratios in there as well, but it's the pace, the electronic systems, you know, the day-to-day. So there may be some other things in there that they are more comfortable with.
It would be very interesting to see stresses, you know, new nurses versus, you know, those who've been in practice for a very long time. Because my biggest stress is the electronic health record. It is
Well,
my
you
biggest
guys,
stress.
I'm surprised you didn't attack. She used, and I challenged it, but the Affordable Care Act, that's what made the difference. And I'd like to suggest the electronic health record revolution was part of it, the press gainies and the patient satisfaction and the pressure on the staff that now have to meet not only their patients' needs, but the environment's requirements on them. And
But looking at that peer-to-peer interaction, I've had graduate students telling me that the older nurses, the more experienced nurses, are not that nice to the newer nurses. And that has changed because the newer nurses are electronically savvy. And they're helping the older nurses with their
which is a nice
documentation.
turnaround.
So it gives them a little more power.
Right.
Did you ever consider, though, the older nurses might be more stressed because their awareness might be more heightened about what to be stressed about?
Right. That's what I was thinking.
I think older nurses might have more stress because they might have other responsibilities and they're worried about who's getting on the school bus or whatever's going on. And a 22-year-old nurse might not have as many other stresses in their life as, you know what I mean? There's other responsibilities that come with being.
Right. I'm thinking also the level of how they perceive the position they have. You know, like they're the single wage earner in their family and they have to make this work. The 22-year-old's like, oh, okay, you know, like if this job doesn't work out, I'll find another one next week, you know, because they know the job's not running.
I've seen you smile over there, and as a new nurse, I'm wondering what you're thinking about that.
I can agree with that because my mom is a nurse. My dad also works. So technically, like, yes, I have a job, but I can always look somewhere else if this job doesn't suit my needs. But also I feel as a new nurse, the pressure doesn't necessarily come from the staff. Like the older staff members enjoy me being there because I can help them with the computer.
Right.
And the stress really comes from the patients because the patients don't respect you. Because, like, I can walk into a room and try and help somebody that's, like, I don't know, 30 or 40 years older than me, but I don't understand their problems, and they understand that. And they'll, like, get mad at you and tell you to leave. So, like, that's where the real stress comes in because you can't always help them. And then they'll report you to the manager, and then the manager will come to you and say, what happened? And it's like, I tried, but, you know, you can't always meet everybody's needs.
And they have Press-Ganey weapons.
Yeah.
They have, and one of the things that we've been looking at in maternal child is when you're trying to teach those important things about health, you know, like don't smoke or breastfeed your baby, and they're not there, and that's against you as the one bringing that good health promotion stuff, and that's directly impacting the Press-Ganeys. And when we're so Press-Ganey focused, I just heard that yesterday in an environment trying to raise their Press-Ganeys by teaching them how to say, no, that's no problem. It's how can I help? It's all of the language of customer satisfaction, and that's what you're experiencing.
It also depends, in the Press-Ganeys, it all depends on the last floor the patient was visited. Most of the time it's your floor, but if they write anything about the emergency room, it comes back on you. If they write anything about any other floor, it comes back on you, no matter if it happened on your floor or not.
Yeah, and we know Press-Ganey has flaws, and these hospitals are using them as the litmus test of the quality of your work and everybody else.
And it's hard for our area because New York and New Jersey are always the lowest on the with the Press-Ganey scores as far as like the nation. I think we go back and forth for 49 and 50th place.
A little more demanding consumer. What I'm going to do is, so that we can make sure everybody gets to have lunch not too late, is to see if there's any last questions. I'm going to also go over here and see if there's anybody who's been muted or has been dying to ask a question outside. I'll give you this opportunity. Hold on a second and I'll make sure I don't have you muted. And any last questions in the room?
I just have a comment. Congratulate you on putting together.
Yes, wonderful work. Wonderful work.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming, and I can't tell you enough how proud you're one of ours and out there doing it. And I think you heard this is important work. And those of you folks who are doctoral students or want to ever be, I think it shows that we don't do research that's just contemplating your navel. We're doing stuff that's really valuable and useful. And I'd like that sort of press to go out about us. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording now.